Hello and welcome to Prairie Pulse. Coming up a little bit later in the show, we'll see and take a look at an Inside Energy story. But first, joining us now is our very own Inside Energy reporter and contributor to Prairie Public, Emily Guerin. Emily, thanks so much for joining us today.
Of course.
Emily, before we start off, you're based in Bismarck, North Dakota, but tell us a little bit about your background and where you're originally from.
Yeah, so I had never been to North Dakota until I came for my job interview, which was April of last year. And I thought to myself, okay, it's pretty cold for April, but I just need a warmer coat. And I think that's the secret to success in North Dakota, is having a warm coat and a good attitude. I'm not a stranger to the winter. I grew up outside of Boston in Massachusetts, and I've lived in Maine for college, and then I actually moved here from Colorado. So I have been in places that are cold before. North Dakota is a special case, but yeah, I'm liking it.
Well, of course, we're going to ask you how you got to North Dakota, but you're going to tell me it's the job. So what interested you in coming to North Dakota?
So before I moved here, I was covering natural resource and environmental issues in the West for a magazine. And it just seemed like, if that's something I really want to do, why not move to a place where that really is the big issue in the state. And Colorado, its economy is so diverse. There are people who really care about natural resource and environmental issues. And then there are people working in tech companies in Denver who it's just really not of interest to them. And in North Dakota, it just felt like an opportunity to cover something that really almost everyone in the state has a connection to. And that was exciting to me. So that ultimately is what drew me here.
Now, I've already called out the name Inside Energy a couple of times here. What is Inside Energy?
Inside Energy is a group of reporters in 3 states, North Dakota, Wyoming, and Colorado. And we cover energy and natural resource issues for public television and public radio. And all of our stories are shared by stations in all 3 states.
Okay. With that said, tell us about some of the stories you've worked on since you've been here.
So when I first got here, some of the early stories were just kind of getting my mind around what was happening in the oil field. And I remember in the very beginning, I would get emails from the state every time there was an oil field spill. So we're talking about oil or wastewater from oil wells. And it seems like I was getting these emails almost every week. Some new spill had happened. And I just wanted to know, is that actually a lot, or do I just think it's a lot because I'm new? And so that was one of my early stories that I've since come back to, is trying to understand why are there spills? How do they happen? What is spilling? Is there more the state could do to prevent it? Is there more companies could do? And so that was a pretty good foray into the regulatory environment in North Dakota, some of the long-term concerns with oil and gas development if it isn't, if wells aren't taken care of towards the end of their lives. So that was an early one, and that was a good dive into some controversy too.
Yeah. Well, what are some of the interesting stories you've covered?
So I feel like they range from being these, focus on, is the state doing a good job regulating the industry? Are companies doing a good job? To stories that are on the opposite end of the spectrum that are fun, lighthearted stories about some of the surprising benefits of oil and gas that you and I might not think about. So in that first group, I would put the series we did on worker fatalities in the oil field. We looked at why North Dakota's oil industry is the most dangerous of any state, and that was a figure we calculated ourselves. And then we tried to compare to other states that were less dangerous, what are they doing differently than us? And so that was a series that ran about a year ago. And then I would say on the opposite end of the spectrum are stories about, so I met some researchers who study worker housing or man camps. And I did a story where I basically just sat in a truck with them for a few days, and we drove to all these RV parks in western North Dakota, and I listened to how they interviewed people, and we admired some of the more decorative RVs. Some people are very creative, flamingos in the yard, repurposed shipping pallets to make fences. And that was a really neat look at kind of the anthropology of the oil field, how people make home in a place that's so far from home. And I like to do a healthy balance of both, because if you're all hard-hitting, investigative all the time, it's a little heavier. It's good to mix it up with the lighter fare.
Yeah. Well, with that said, has your reporting been met positively? Because I know you've done some stories that are pretty tough issues, and
right.
and maybe point some fingers or insinuate some things that are tough issues.
I think it's been mixed. I think that some of the stories I've done that have been more hard-hitting have been met positively, like the worker fatality series. I was able to speak with the governor, and he acknowledged in our interview that it was something that the worker fatality issue in North Dakota was something that he could be doing more to address. So that was sort of a positive reaction to attention we brought to an issue. On the other hand, some of my coverage of spills was not met as favorably by the state. We received a very long list of things we had done wrong in the story, which after subsequent examination were not actually wrong. They were just, we had a difference of perspective about, how the story should be told. And so things were a little frosty with some of the state regulators after that. But, one of my mentors once told me that if you're in this business to make friends, you're in the wrong business. And on the dark days where I'm not making friends, I try to remember that's not the point. People don't have to like me; they just have to think I'm fair. And so that's the goal.
Okay. Well, you mentioned a little bit about traveling in western North Dakota and in the oil fields, but what's it like for you, and in a bigger perspective of how eye-opening is it with what's going on out there? Just recently, it was sort of like the wild, wild west of the old days, is the way some people phrased it.
So I think being a woman in particular, when I moved here, I had just heard all of these horror stories about being a woman in the oil field. Sherry Arnold, of course, the teacher from Sidney, Montana, who was murdered, is the name. That name comes to everyone's mind when they think about being a woman in the oil field. And so my first time in the Bakken, I very much remember just feeling scared on the street. And thinking back about that, I don't feel that way anymore. Like, I think the more you go, the more you realize this is a community not like every other community, but this is a community, and there are people who live here and people who make their lives here, and it's not deadwood. There's not shootouts in the streets. And if you're smart about it, I think you can stay out of dangerous places. I have had a few experiences that, in retrospect, maybe I shouldn't have done that. There was one night when I was in Newtown on the Fort Berthold Reservation. This was still at the height of the boom when oil prices were high. All the hotels were full in Newtown. And so I slept in my car. And in retrospect, maybe I shouldn't have slept in my car, being a woman alone. But, again, I felt like that was something where I made a choice. It ended up working out okay. Maybe I wouldn't do it again. But no harm has ever come to me as a woman. I've never felt threatened. And I would encourage other women to not avoid the oil field because you think it's this scary place, but just to be smart while you're there.
Okay. Well, let's talk a minute about the slowdown right now in the state's oil economy. You talked about when it was booming. Now that it's experiencing a lull, maybe, is it really a slowdown, or is it just a blip going down and go back up, or what's being said?
So for a while, it wasn't clear how much of a slowdown it really was, because every winter in North Dakota, a lot of people leave the state. Drilling companies don't like to drill as often in the winter. Fracking companies don't like to frack. So we really didn't see the effects of the low oil prices, which, by the way, started to drop last fall. We didn't really see that until March or so. And I went to a job fair in Williston in March, and that's where it was really clear, okay, there's a lot of people here who've been laid off and who aren't being hired again as spring comes and work should pick up again. And so there have been a lot of layoffs, and in the oil industry they like to call it a price correction. They have little euphemisms for everything. But I think what they mean by that is everyone knew $100 a barrel oil was too high. I think people think $30 or $40 a barrel is too low, but I think there is this acknowledgement that it was sort of a bubble. And I think the companies are hoping for it to end up in the $60 to $70 a barrel range, and they would be comfortable with that.
Mm-hmm. Well, with that said, how do you approach a story? How do you get your story ideas? Can you just tell us about that?
So my editor compares reporting on energy in North Dakota to shooting fish in a barrel. It's like, oh my gosh, I have a list 10 miles long. What am I going to choose? So it's almost like triage then, which is a good problem to have as a reporter. So I try to pick the stories that have appeal to people in our other states. That's one of the interesting things about working with 3 states is I can't do purely local North Dakota issues. So for example, I might find a story that is happening here in a different way, but is also happening in other places. And I think people in other states might be able to learn from our experience and vice versa. So that's one criteria I use. I try to pick stories where there's really good scenes and characters, and so we're not just hearing from expert after expert with really long titles and state officials. I think those people are wonderful and they're a huge resource to me, but I often find what makes the most compelling storytelling is talking to the people who never get interviewed, for whom I have to explain, this is my recorder, I'm going to hold it close, and that's just such a privilege to be able to meet and interview people like that. So if I can get out, get into someone's home, sit at their kitchen table and talk about how some huge macroeconomic issue is affecting them, then that's kind of my favorite thing.
Yeah. But are you working on breaking news ever, or are you more looking for longer, in-depth type stories?
A little bit of both. I mean, covering the oil field, there is a lot of breaking news. There's spills, there's train derailments, there's unfortunately, there's worker fatalities. Mm-hmm. And so when those things happen, we had a train derailment this early May, and I dropped what I was doing and drove up there to see what was going on. So there is some of that. I would say for the most part, some of the other wonderful Prairie Public News team are able to take care of that, so that I can do some more longer, in-depth features.
Mm-hmm. Well, with that said, you mentioned it a little bit, but talk more about some of the workers you've met and you've mm-hmm. interviewed, and they've left their families a lot mm-hmm. of times to come here to make their fortune, so to speak, or to get some good paying jobs, but it's a tough life too.
It is, and it's been interesting. When I first came, it was hard for me to understand why people would do this, and it was hard to understand what it must be like for them at home that would drive them to move somewhere they'd never been, to live in an RV in the North Dakota winter. And I slowly came to understand that for some people it is a challenge and they don't love it, but I've met a lot of people who just, that's their life. I mean, I met one man from West Texas who told me, I go where the oil is. And he just, he lives in RVs, he lives in mobile homes, and he has a home in Texas that he's paying the mortgage on. His kids are in high school, so he goes home every few weeks, and that's just his life. And I've met a lot of people who like that. It's sort of an adventure for them. And of course it pays very well, and, they are able to support their lifestyle back home. And I think what we're seeing increasingly as the boom becomes more mature in North Dakota is that people are bringing their families up here, because they are realizing that even with the price of oil being, in the $30 to $40 barrel range, there are still a lot of jobs that will always be here. And so it in some ways it is a boom bust economy, but in some ways it's becoming like there's this steady level of employment that will always be here. And so I think people that are able to have those jobs are choosing to bring their families up more. And I do think people, no one really wants to be separated from their family forever. So I do see some of those more itinerant workers choosing to rent an apartment, buy a home. So that's been changing a little bit.
Okay. Can you talk some about how the energy boom, is different or similar in North Dakota compared to Colorado and Wyoming?
I would say the biggest difference is the public perception of the energy boom. So as we mentioned earlier, I used to live in Colorado, and there's a very strong grassroots opposition to oil and gas development there, especially along the Front Range outside of Denver, where literally there are drilling rigs, behind people's homes, behind their schools. It's much more intimate there, I think. Here, a lot of the activity, it might be near one person's house, but North Dakota is so rural, it's not as often in a community. And in Colorado, it's really butting up against, people's homes and schools and businesses, and so there's a lot more opposition to it there. And as a result, the oil companies there take different precautionary measures than they take here. Like they might build a sound barrier around a drilling rig, or they might cover their flares so they don't have the light pollution. And in North Dakota, you just don't see that. And I think part of it is that we're so rural, but I think part of it is that Western North Dakota was losing people for so long that having an industry that allows your children to come back and have jobs and live at home again, like that, I find for many people outweighs almost all the negative impacts. Is that, my 3 daughters came back, or my son left, and now my grandkids are back with him. And in Colorado, the economy is just so much more diverse that people, they don't need the energy industry as much, which I think allows them the space to be more critical of it.
Yeah. Do you think crime in the oil patch has been a big deal? I mean, obviously an influx of people and infrastructure catching up. Is it been overplayed, or is it a real issue?
You know, that's an interesting question, and I think I used to think it had been overplayed, and now I would say I think it has been sensationalized a little bit, like the Sherry Arnold murder we talked about, making women feel super unsafe out there. I mean, I think that's the kind of thing that has gone a little bit over the top, but it is true that there is a lot more crime than there used to be, and some of it has been an increase that's proportional to population, but when you talk with the Attorney General or the U.S. Attorney, I mean, they're very concerned about the increase in organized crime in North Dakota. That is not something we ever had. And now there are particularly organized drug crime and organized sex trafficking related crimes. And that's something, I think those would be the two areas they point to as being the most concern for them. And there are some new initiatives to address sex trafficking and organized drug crime, but it's still very hard for the local law enforcement to get a handle on because they themselves are still understaffed and they have quite a bit of turnover. And so I do think crime, I mean, I was asked recently what I thought the biggest challenges were in the oil field, and I said crime and the cost of housing. So I think it's still a huge issue.
Well, what about your thoughts on the New York Times stories about regarding sort of the cozy relationship between the oil companies and North Dakota public officials?
Yeah, you know, it's always funny being a local reporter when the New York Times comes in and does a story and you're like, wait, I've been covering that all along. But I think they actually did an excellent job. And one of the things that they did that was so impressive to me was they made all this confusing state data about wastewater and oil field spills available to the public. So now you can go and see how many spills Continental Resources, which is an oil company, has had, and it's easily sortable. So that's a huge service. I think that their stories, you know, they came in with an outsider's perspective, and so they didn't justify some of the things they saw the way some of us local reporters might do. Oh, well, that's the way it's always been. That's not a big deal. You know, they came in with fresh eyes and they said, oh, you know, why is it that the Industrial Commission, why are the people who regulate oil and gas all elected? And why can they take contributions from oil companies? And that's not how it's done in other places. What does it mean that the people who regulate this industry can also, you know, be elected with money from that industry? And so I think they did a service to the state of North Dakota in pointing out how we appear elsewhere. I think what people criticized them for was not understanding some of the motivations of people in the state. As we mentioned, you know, the state having lost population for many years, I think explains a lot about why people are so enthusiastic about this boom. And if you're not from here and you don't know what it's like to have your kids leave and to have, you know, your neighbor on the farm leave, it's harder to appreciate why the state regulates the industry the way it does.
Emily, we've only got about a minute left, and there's been documentaries done, The Overnighters, White Earth, but I understand you're organizing an energy summit. Is this to help inform the public about what's going on?
Yeah, I'm definitely trying to organize an energy summit. I'm thinking of it as kind of a Bakken film festival. There's been so many documentaries made about this oil boom. I mean, I just have this list that goes on, and I think that a lot of these are not often shown within the state. You know, they go to Sundance Film Festival, they go to some film festival in New York City, and it would just be great for people here to see how we're perceived by others.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, I've got a lot of other questions I wished I could ask you, but understand you've recently completed a story. Mm-hmm. Can you kind of set that up, and then we're going to watch it?
Yeah, so again, so these small western North Dakota towns losing population for many years, that would result in the school getting smaller. One town in particular, their school got so small they lost all their varsity sports. This is the town of Alexander. And now with the oil boom coming back, there's all these people in the school, so they're able to have sports back. So I went to the first varsity football game in 28 years, and that's the story we'll see.
And let's take a look at that right now.
Okay.
It's the day before the first game of the season for the Alexander Comets. The players are really excited.
I can't wait for tomorrow to come. My head's gonna explode right now if tomorrow doesn't hurry up and get here.
For 28 years, Alexander didn't have a football team. Now it does, thanks to new kids like Jay Morgan, number 34. Morgan's mom moved from Bakersfield, California to North Dakota last year. She came for a job at a truck stop in the Bakken oil field.
Okay, so let's go from the 30 all the way down. Now we can at least see where we're at here.
Football coach Kevin Clausen says about half of the kids on the team are here because of the oil field.
But I feel like because of the oil boom, we now have a football team. You know, it has brought many families to this school, which increased the enrollment and, you know, gave the school the capability to actually do this.
Before the oil boom took off in 2008, Alexander's single K-12 school only had 55 kids, and there were no varsity sports. Like so many small towns on the Great Plains, Alexander was shrinking as young people moved away and farms grew larger and more mechanized.
Now, Brian, do you identify which muscle you injured?
Superintendent Leslie Bieber remembers what that felt like.
I don't want to say that it was bad. It wasn't, because you still had that small community coming together and helping each other out. But it was sad to see a community die.
The Bakken oil boom has changed all that. The town has grown by 60% since 2008, and now there are more than 200 kids in the school. And the kids are still coming, despite low oil prices and thousands of layoffs. There's finally enough students to bring back varsity sports, including football. Well, at least 6-man football. The school is still too small for 11-man. Still, Bieber says people in town could not be more excited.
When we laid the sod for the football field, it was 90-some degrees, and I live across the street from the football field, and so I was watching thinking, oh, those poor guys. Community members came in the middle of the afternoon to help lay the sod when it was 90-some degrees. That doesn't happen unless you are excited about bringing that back.
The team that's going to play a football game today, we're playing 6-man football.
The Comets' first football game took place during Alexander's Old Settlers Days, the town's annual celebration of its farming and ranching heritage. After the parade, everyone, including the football team, wandered over to the massive barbecue pit. There, the men of Alexander were digging up meat that had been slow cooked overnight, the same way they'd done it for years and years. Working the meat cutting table is Jerry Hatter, the mayor of Alexander. He also works for a drilling company. Hatter has a pretty complicated relationship with the oil field, like many people I met here. On the one hand, he's grateful for all the new families moving into town. On the other hand, it's overwhelming.
Everything grew so fast and there were so many people, and western North Dakota never had a lot of people. And I think just the influx of all the people is what really did it for a lot of people.
Alexander may have been slowly dying before the oil boom, but some people liked it that way. Hatter is one of them.
I hate the fact that I can drive down places that there was never anything, and it's nothing but solid pumping units and roads and traffic, and it's changed the landscape, but it's given me a lot, so.
The oil boom is really love-hate for people here in Alexander. So that's why the return of football is so important. It's something everyone can be excited about, no matter how they feel about the oil field. After the barbecue, it was time for the big game.
Let's go, Comets! Let's go!
The place was packed. People drove their pickups right onto the edge of the field. Both old and new Alexander were there. Locals like Mayor Jerry Hatter. People who lived here long before the boom got started. And newcomers, people drawn here for work. Everyone was hoping the Comets would win, but as the game went on, that seemed like a long shot. The Grass Range Winnett Rangers, from a small high school in eastern Montana, were bigger and more experienced than the Comets. They intercepted a lot of Comets passes and scored a lot of touchdowns. But unless you looked at the scoreboard, you'd have no way of knowing the Comets were losing, by a lot. The crowd cheered at every tackle, even if the Comets let the Ranger player run 30 yards first. People were just happy to be there, visiting with their neighbors, hanging out with their friends. This is the sense of community that was missing those 28 years that Alexander didn't have football. And bringing it back is especially meaningful for people like Leanna Halverson Dean.
In this community, farmers, ranchers, you get caught up in your lives and you lose track. And it's nice to have everybody back.
Even if it wasn't the glorious victory they hoped for, just having football back is a win for Alexander. For Inside Energy, I'm Emily Guerin.
Well, that's all we have on Prairie Pulse for this week. And as always, thanks for watching.
Inside Energy is a project of Prairie Public in cooperation with public broadcasters in Colorado and Wyoming, funded in part by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. See more at insideenergy.org. And by the members of Prairie Public.